June 13, 1942, Long Island, before dawn. If the men stepping off a German submarine onto this beach are not stopped now, the war will begin inside the United States without warning. Not with bombs falling from the sky, but with power stations failing, rail lines breaking, factories burning from the inside out. If this landing succeeds, there will be no front line to point to and no clear moment when it all started. There will only be damage spread out over weeks, blamed on accidents. The submarine slips back into the dark water. The men turn inland. At this moment, nothing is stopping them. They were sent for one reason only, to prove that distance meant nothing, that the Atlantic was not a barrier, that the American mainland could be reached, entered, and quietly dismantled from within. The plan did not depend on speed or force. It depended on time, months of freedom, months of anonymity. Enough silence for sabotage to look like coincidence. They carried explosives designed for factories and rail yards, timers calibrated for delayed ignition, forged papers, cash, and precise instructions. Each target had been selected for its effect on production, not its visibility. No explosions meant to make headlines, only pressure, accumulating damage that would slow a war without announcing itself. From the outside, the plan looked careful. From the inside, it was brittle. The first cracks appeared almost immediately. The beach was not empty. A single Coast Guard patrolman emerged from the darkness where no one expected him to be. The encounter was brief, awkward, and irreversible. Money was offered. Explanations were given. Too many words were spoken. The patrolman walked away uncertain, but suspicion had already been planted. The saboteurs buried their equipment in the sand, discarded their uniforms, and scattered toward New York, convinced they had outrun the danger. They had not. The report moved up the chain faster than they moved inland. By the time they checked into hotels and bought train tickets, the clock was already running against them. The collapse did not come from pursuit. It came from inside the group. One man broke, not under arrest, not under pressure. He walked into an FBI office and confessed everything: names, locations, targets, landing sites. The second team, which had come ashore days earlier in Florida under similar conditions, was exposed before it had even unpacked its equipment. Within days, the entire operation was contained. Not disrupted. Contained. The country they expected to disappear into did not grant them time. Wartime routines closed around them. Hotel ledgers, ticket stubs, cash movements, witness reports. Nothing dramatic, just compression. Options vanished not because of brilliance, but because once intent was known, delay was no longer tolerated. None of the targets were reached. None of the explosives were used. The mission designed to unfold over months ended before it began. The response was final and deliberately quiet. A military tribunal removed the case from public uncertainty. Evidence was direct. Confessions were complete. There was no debate about motive or intent. 6 of the 8 men were executed. The others were imprisoned. The process moved fast, not out of panic, but to prevent the operation from becoming anything larger than it already was. Operation Pastorius did not reveal American weakness. It revealed how thin the margin had always been, how sabotage depends entirely on silence, how a plan built on secrecy collapses the moment trust fails once. The war never noticed the interruption. Factories kept running. Rail lines stayed intact. The damage that was supposed to accumulate never began. The beaches where the submarine surfaced returned to routine. The footprints were erased by the tide. What remained was not fear, but certainty. That on American soil, time would not be granted. That exposure would not lead to pursuit, but to termination. That once the plan was seen, there would be no second act. Operation Pastorius ended without explosions, without disruption, and without legacy beyond its own failure. It brought the war to the American shoreline for a moment, and then it stopped there. What followed was not escalation, but erasure. Once the arrests were complete, there was no reason to keep the operation alive in public space. No alerts, no announcements, no attempt to turn the incident into spectacle. The system moved to close it down as efficiently as it had uncovered it. Files replaced movement. Statements replaced plans. The war absorbed the interruption without changing pace. For the men involved, the compression was total. They had trained for isolation, for patience, for living inside a foreign country without being seen. Instead, they moved from landing to confinement without ever establishing a rhythm. The skills they carried had no environment to operate in. There was no underground network, no sympathetic infrastructure, no margin for recovery once silence broke. The tribunal did not function like a trial meant to persuade. It functioned like a mechanism meant to end a problem. Evidence was not contested in public. Confessions were not dramatized. The process was narrow by design, removing ambiguity and accelerating finality. The operation was reframed not as espionage, but as an act of war carried out inside national borders. That framing allowed speed, and speed denied the mission any afterlife. Executions followed quickly. They were carried out without ceremony, without audience, without narrative. The intention was not punishment as example, but closure. The matter was ended before it could harden into myth or fear. What remained was procedure, not memory. From the German side, there was no attempt to reinterpret the failure. The lesson was immediate. Sabotage on the American mainland required time, and time could not be protected. Distance did not translate into invisibility. Normalcy did not equal inattention. Once alerted, the environment became hostile to secrecy almost instantly. The concept was abandoned, not revised. The operation's failure was not dramatic enough to linger. There were no ruined factories to photograph, no scorched rail lines to revisit, nothing tangible to point to as evidence that the threat had ever existed. Without damage, memory faded quickly. The war moved on to places where its outcomes were louder and easier to measure. What makes Operation Pastorius unsettling is not what it destroyed, but how close it came to mattering, and how completely that possibility was denied. The difference between irrelevance and catastrophe was measured in hours, a single encounter on a dark beach, a single decision to speak instead of wait. There was no second chance built into the plan, no redundancy for internal collapse. Once one man broke, everything else followed automatically. The operation did not degrade, it stopped. In the end, the Atlantic did not shrink. The front line did not move inward. The war brushed the American shoreline and withdrew, leaving behind nothing but paperwork and precedent. The system had been tested once, briefly, and it responded without hesitation. That response was the real outcome, not victory, not fear, but certainty. A clear understanding that any future attempt would face the same compression, the same refusal to allow time to work in its favor. Sabotage without time was inert, and time, once denied, could not be recovered. Operation Pastorius was designed to unfold slowly, invisibly, over months. It ended in days. Its failure was complete enough that it left no shadow. And because of that, it remains one of the few moments in the war where the threat arrived, was neutralized, and disappeared without leaving a mark. That disappearance was intentional. The operation was not allowed to become a reference point, not allowed to linger as an example of vulnerability narrowly avoided. The system treated it as a malfunction corrected, not a crisis survived. Once resolved, it was folded back into routine and stripped of urgency. What remained in the record was stark: dates, names, confessions, a sequence so compressed it almost feels unreal in retrospect. The saboteurs had expected America to be wide and slow, to offer space in which mistakes could be absorbed. Instead, the environment behaved like a closed circuit. The moment an anomaly entered it, everything accelerated toward resolution. There was no dramatic tightening of security visible to the public, no sudden sense of siege. The response operated beneath the surface, quietly aligning agencies and authorities that had already been conditioned by war. The country did not need to change its posture. It only needed to notice once. The men at the center of the operation never regained initiative after that first notice. They were reduced to reaction immediately, and reaction is fatal to a plan built on patience. Each choice narrowed their options further. Each attempt to blend in left a trace. The environment did not have to be perfect, it only had to be faster than they were. In the months that followed, the war produced events of far greater scale and violence. Entire cities were destroyed. Front lines shifted across continents. Against that backdrop, Operation Pastorius shrank even further, its failure too clean to compete for attention. It became something studied quietly, if at all, by those concerned with process rather than spectacle. But its implications were enduring. It demonstrated that modern states do not need to anticipate every threat in advance. They only need to react decisively once intent is exposed. The speed of that reaction can matter more than its sophistication. In this case, it erased the threat before it could assume any shape at all. The saboteurs had been trained to believe that secrecy was a condition they could maintain indefinitely. What they encountered instead was fragility. Secrecy did not fail gradually, it collapsed instantly. Once broken, there was no mechanism to rebuild it under pressure. That fragility is why the story ends the way it does. Not with a confrontation, not with a last attempt to salvage meaning from failure, but with quiet finality. The operation did not transform into something else. It did not adapt. It simply stopped. The beaches remained beaches. The cities named as targets never felt the war they had been assigned to absorb. The distance across the Atlantic reasserted itself, reinforced not by geography, but by certainty. Operation Pastorius stands as a moment when the war briefly touched American soil and was denied permission to stay. No explosions announced its arrival, no damage marked its departure, only a rapid compression of events that left nothing behind to recover, reinterpret, or repeat. And in that absence, the operation's failure was complete. What lingered after was not fear, but a narrowing of possibility. The operation had shown that there would be no long middle phase on American soil, no gray zone where intent could remain ambiguous. The moment a plan revealed itself, it would be treated as finished business. That understanding did not require public acknowledgement. It settled quietly into procedure. For the men who had planned the mission, the outcome was definitive enough to end the idea entirely. There was no effort to refine the concept, no second attempt under a different name. Sabotage required patience, trust, and insulation from scrutiny. None of those could be guaranteed. The risk was absolute, and the payoff uncertain. In wartime calculus, that was enough to discard it. The case itself became a reference point only in closed rooms, not for its ingenuity, but for its speed. Analysts noted how quickly routine systems, patrols, reports, records, had aligned once suspicion crossed a threshold. There was no dramatic intelligence coup, just ordinary mechanisms activated without delay. The lesson was procedural, not inspirational. For the public, there was little to absorb. No images of destruction, no sense of having narrowly escaped catastrophe. Without visible consequence, memory had nothing to attach itself to. The war, elsewhere loud and consuming, drowned out a threat that had ended before it could be felt. And yet the margin had been real. The explosives were real. The targets were real. The intent was not hypothetical. What prevented impact was not luck, but timing measured in hours. A single encounter on a dark beach. A single decision not to wait. After that, everything accelerated beyond recovery. The operation did not fail because it was impossible. It failed because it was intolerant of exposure, and exposure came immediately. Once that happened, there was no space left for skill or training to matter. The environment did not reward persistence. It punished delay. This is why the story resists dramatization. There is no arc of escalation, no chase to extend tension. The tension exists only at the beginning when nothing has yet gone wrong. After that, the outcome is a straight line. Short, unforgiving, final. The war ended years later, far from those beaches. When it did, Operation Pastorius was already sealed in the past, unchanged by hindsight. It had not altered strategy, slowed production, or shifted morale. Its significance lay entirely in prevention, and prevention leaves no monument. What remains is a brief moment when the war tested the boundary of distance and found it reinforced by speed. The Atlantic was crossed, the shoreline was reached, and then the attempt stopped, not by force, but by refusal to allow time to exist. That refusal was enough. That refusal shaped everything that came after, even if it was never named. The operation did not trigger alarms or speeches. It did not produce a new public doctrine. It simply disappeared, and in that disappearance, it set a boundary. From that point on, the idea that sabotage teams could be inserted into the continental United States and allowed to operate independently was no longer theoretical. It had been tested once and denied completely. What makes Operation Pastorius distinct is not how close it came to success, but how quickly it lost relevance. Most failed operations leave residue, partial damage, unanswered questions, a sense of almost. This one left none. It moved from landing to irrelevance so fast that there was no opportunity for reinterpretation. It did not even fail publicly. It was resolved privately and efficiently before it could acquire meaning. The men involved were never given the chance to become symbols. They were not framed as masterminds or threats narrowly averted. They were processed as a solved problem. Their training, ideology, and preparation were flattened into evidence exhibits and sworn statements. Once those statements were complete, nothing remained to be extracted from them. The tribunal's speed reinforced that erasure. It did not invite debate. It did not allow the operation to expand in narrative space. The decision to handle the case under military authority removed it from the rhythms of civilian justice, where time itself can generate significance. Here, time was denied from beginning to end. That denial was intentional. Sabotage depends on anticipation as much as action. It seeks to create uncertainty about what might happen next, about what has already been compromised. Operation Pastorius was prevented from doing either. By ending it quickly, the system denied it psychological impact as well as physical effect. The threat did not linger long enough to change behavior. From the outside, this can look like overreaction. From the inside, it was containment. The planners understood that the danger was not the explosives already carried ashore, but the precedent of tolerance. Allowing the operation to unfold even partially would have granted it legitimacy as a method. Ending it immediately ensured it remained an anomaly. In Germany, the absence of follow-up spoke louder than any report. There was no second wave, no revised insertion, no attempt to correct errors. The concept was abandoned because it had failed in the only way that mattered. It had revealed that the environment would not permit recovery. A single failure was enough to invalidate the entire approach. Years later, the episode would be revisited as a legal case, a footnote in intelligence history, a brief chapter in World War II studies. But those frameworks missed the core of what happened. Operation Pastorius was not defeated by superior counterintelligence or dramatic intervention. It was defeated by compression, by the collapse of time. Everything about the plan assumed duration, time to move, time to observe, time to blend in. Time for damage to accumulate slowly enough to evade attribution. None of that existed. The moment intent surfaced, duration vanished. The environment became hostile not through force, but through acceleration. That is why the operation feels almost unreal in retrospect. It has the shape of something interrupted mid-sentence. It begins with intention and ends with closure, skipping the middle entirely. There is no campaign phase to analyze, no operational learning curve, just a short, sharp termination. The beaches where it began do not remember it because nothing unfolded there beyond arrival. The cities named as targets never absorbed the pressure meant for them. The war went on as if this episode had never occurred, because in practical terms, it had not. And yet, the implication remained. The Atlantic could be crossed. The shoreline could be reached. But permission to operate was not granted by geography. It was granted or denied by time, and in this case, time was denied completely. Operation Pastorius ended not with destruction, but with absence. No damage, no disruption, no echo. Just the quiet certainty that some methods, once tested, do not get a second chance. That certainty hardened without announcement. It did not become doctrine written in public language. It became assumption. From that moment forward, the idea of prolonged covert sabotage on American soil was treated as untenable, not because it was immoral or impractical, but because it was operationally fragile. It could not survive first contact with routine. Routine was the decisive factor. Patrols that existed for other reasons. Clerks who logged names and times without knowing why it might matter. Clerks who noticed when something did not fit. A single report that did not stall or get buried. None of this was exceptional. That was the point. The system did not rise to meet the threat. It was already there, moving at a pace the operation could not match. The men sent ashore had been told to expect slack. They had been briefed on openness, on a country not yet conditioned to think inward. What they encountered instead was density. Movement compressed into records. Decisions leaving trails. Silence breaking knot. In one dramatic moment, but in small, ordinary ways that added up faster than they could be undone. Once that happened, there was no way to slow the collapse. Every hour increased exposure. Every attempt to wait made the situation worse. The plan required patience, but patience became indistinguishable from paralysis. Initiative vanished, replaced by caution that only accelerated the end. The confession did not create the failure. It revealed it. By the time one man chose to speak, the operation had already lost its most valuable asset, time without scrutiny. The confession merely made the outcome unavoidable. It closed the remaining gaps and allowed the system to act without restraint. Afterward, the absence of reaction became its own signal. There were no new security measures announced because none were needed. There were no visible changes to daily life because the threat had not penetrated far enough to require them. The country did not feel attacked because, in effect, it had not been. This is why Operation Pastorius remains difficult to place emotionally. It contains all the elements of danger, explosives, targets, intent, but none of the expected consequences. It is a story where the climax is prevention and the resolution is silence. That makes it easy to overlook and hard to dramatize. But within that silence lies the essential point. The war did not need to adapt to stop this operation. It only needed to continue operating as it already was. The saboteurs arrived expecting space. They found compression. They arrived expecting delay. They encountered immediacy. They arrived expecting time. They were denied it completely. When the final files were closed, there was no sense of having turned back an invasion. There was only the confirmation that the attempt had been structurally unsound from the moment it touched shore. The Atlantic had been crossed, but the threshold that mattered had not. Operation Pastorius did not end with lessons proclaimed or reforms announced. It ended with a quiet understanding absorbed into practice. That understanding was simple and unforgiving. Any future attempt would be met the same way, not with drama, but with speed. The war would continue to test limits elsewhere. Here, the limit had been found immediately. The attempt ended where it began, not in failure that unfolded, but in failure that arrived all at once. What makes that ending so complete is that nothing needed to be added to it. There was no corrective phase, no period of reassessment followed by adjustment. The system did not ask how to improve its response, because the response had already been sufficient. The operation had been neutralized before it could demand anything more. In most cases, failure produces momentum of its own. It invites explanation, generates alternatives, creates pressure to try again differently. Operation Pastorius produced none of that. Its collapse was so absolute that there was no incentive to salvage the concept. The margin for error had been revealed as non-existent. Any repeat attempt would face the same compression, the same refusal to grant time, the same certainty of exposure. For the individuals involved, this meant there was no space left to redefine themselves. They did not become agents in exile or fugitives operating on borrowed time. They became detainees almost immediately, their relevance shrinking with each passing hour. The plan that had given them purpose vanished, and with it any leverage they might have had. The environment they encountered did not need to be hostile in the traditional sense. It did not chase them through streets or surround them with force. It simply closed, records connected, reports aligned, authority clarified. Once that process began, there was no place for improvisation. The operation had been designed for freedom of movement, not confinement by routine. This is why the episode feels disproportionate to its intent. The planners imagined months of impact. They received days of containment. The scale of preparation met the smallest possible window of execution and was extinguished inside it. The mismatch is almost total. In the broader arc of the war, this moment barely registers. It did not alter campaigns or shift resources. It did not appear on maps or casualty charts. But it defined a boundary nonetheless. It marked the point at which the idea of internal sabotage on American soil ceased to be viable, not by decree, but by demonstration. The shoreline where the men landed offers no indication of what briefly passed through it. The sand holds no memory. The water erases without preference. What happened there exists only because it ended so quickly that it could be documented completely. Nothing was lost to chaos. Nothing escaped the record. And that is the final irony of Operation Pastorius. A mission built on secrecy is remembered precisely because it never operated long enough to generate confusion. Its failure was clean. Its end was tidy. Its significance lies not in what it achieved, but in how thoroughly it was denied the chance to try. The war continued to consume lives and territory elsewhere, loud and unambiguous. Here, it touched land, was recognized, and was turned away without noise. No explosion marked the moment. No fire announced it. Only the quiet certainty that once exposed, the attempt was already over. That is where the story finally settles. Not in spectacle or warning, but in absence. A plan that depended on time encountered a system that refused to provide it. And without time, nothing else mattered. After that, there was nothing left for the operation to become. It did not drift into ambiguity or survive in fragments. It was sealed, archived, and rendered inert by the same speed that had destroyed it. What usually follows a failed covert action, rumors, exaggeration, counterclaims, never appeared. There was no space for them. The absence itself became the outcome. In later years, the episode would occasionally surface in legal discussions, cited for the precedent it set rather than the danger it posed. The use of a military tribunal, the scope of executive authority during wartime, the distinction between espionage and unlawful combat. But those conversations existed far from the beach, far from the moment where the plan actually collapsed. They dealt with consequence, not cause. The cause was simpler and colder. The planners had misunderstood how little tolerance there was for uncertainty once intent was visible. They believed exposure would trigger investigation. What it triggered instead was resolution. There was no phase where the operation was under review. It went directly from existence to termination. This is why the story feels incomplete, in a way most wartime narratives do not. There is no escalation to track, no adaptation, no countermeasure introduced in response to pressure. The pressure never built. It was applied all at once, and the structure failed immediately. Sabotage, more than any other form of warfare, depends on the illusion that time belongs to the attacker. That illusion shattered the moment the patrolman filed his report. From then on, time belonged entirely to the system responding. Every hour favored containment, not action. Every delay benefited the defenders, not the infiltrators. The men ashore sensed this before it was confirmed. Their movements slowed. Decisions became conservative. Waiting replaced initiative. And in sabotage, waiting is fatal. Momentum cannot be regained once it is lost. The environment does not reset. By the time arrests were made, the operation was already functionally dead. Custody simply formalized what had already happened. The tribunal did not end the mission. It documented its failure. Nothing about the episode suggests inevitability in advance. Had the landing gone unnoticed for a few days, the story would be different. Had silence held a little longer, damage might have followed. That is what makes the failure so stark. The margin between catastrophe and irrelevance was real, and it was narrow. But margins do not matter once crossed. Operation Pastorius crossed its margin within hours. After that, everything moved in one direction only. There were no forks in the road, no alternative outcomes waiting to be explored. The plan did not unravel. It collapsed. When historians later described it as a fiasco, the word almost overstated the drama. There was no chaos, no confusion, no desperate improvisation, just a clean termination of possibility. A door closed before anything could pass through it. The war would go on to produce disasters measured in cities and lives. This was not one of them. Its significance lies entirely in what it prevented, and prevention rarely announces itself. The saboteurs reached America, and then nothing happened. That silence was the result. That silence carried its own weight. It marked the end of a possibility that had existed only briefly and would never be tested again. Once closed, it stayed closed, not because of fear, but because the logic of the failure was too clear to ignore. The operation had not been unlucky. It had been incompatible with the environment it entered. The planners had assumed that America's scale would dilute attention, that openness would create gaps, that normal life would mask intent. What they encountered instead was a system where ordinary processes produced extraordinary speed once aligned. A single report moved without friction. Authority clarified itself almost immediately. What looked diffuse from the outside behaved as a single mechanism when engaged. This is the part that often goes unnoticed. There was no dramatic shift from peace to emergency, no visible transition. The country did not need to become something else to stop the operation. It only needed to continue being what it already was, but without hesitation. That continuity was decisive. The saboteurs never reached a phase where their presence altered behavior. No one rerouted trains, no factories shut down, no schedules changed. Their existence did not register beyond the small circle tasked with ending it. Without impact, the operation never entered public consciousness as a threat. It remained administrative from beginning to end. That administrative quality is what ultimately defined the outcome. The mission was neutralized not by confrontation, but by procedure, not by force, but by compression. It was denied the narrative oxygen required to grow into something larger. And without that oxygen, it suffocated quietly. In the years that followed, other threats would be imagined, exaggerated, and sometimes mishandled. This one was not. It was met once, decisively, and set aside. The clarity of that response made repetition unnecessary. There was nothing left to test. Operation Pastorius stands apart because it reveals how thin the line can be between disaster and irrelevance. The explosives were real. The targets were real. The intent was explicit. What failed was not commitment or capability, but time. The moment time slipped away, everything else followed. There is no final image to close on, no wreckage, no memorial. Just a quiet record showing how quickly a plan can vanish when it encounters a system unwilling to let it breathe. The war pressed on elsewhere, louder and bloodier, leaving this episode behind without ceremony. The saboteurs reached American soil. The plan did not survive the landing. By the time the machinery closed around them, there was no suspense left inside the system. Every variable had been accounted for, every loose end tied off. What remained was not the question of whether the operation would fail, but how completely it would be erased. The men were no longer treated as infiltrators in motion. They were treated as a finished problem. Their plans existed only on paper now, frozen and inert. The explosives they had carried never left storage. The targets they had memorized never moved closer. Everything that was supposed to unfold gradually had been reduced to evidence. Outside the rooms where decisions were finalized, nothing reflected the danger that had briefly existed. Trains ran on schedule. Factories operated without interruption. Cities slept through nights that had once been meant to hold the first signs of sabotage. The absence of consequence became undeniable. This was the closing window, the moment when the operation passed from something that could have happened into something that never would. There would be no correction, no appeal to time, no chance to redefine the outcome. Whatever meaning the mission was going to have was already fixed. And it was not the meaning its planners intended. What remained was simply execution of closure. Not dramatic, not symbolic, just final. The sentences were carried out quietly. No audience, no delay, no extension of the story beyond what was necessary to end it. With that, Operation Pastorius ceased to exist as an active reality and became a closed record. Nothing followed. No retaliation. No copycat attempts. No escalation. The war continued elsewhere, vast and consuming, while this episode left no trace on daily life. The factories named in the plans kept running. The rail lines stayed intact. The power stations never flickered. The damage meant to accumulate never began. The beaches where the submarines surfaced returned to their ordinary silence. Footprints disappeared with the tide. There were no markers to indicate how briefly the distance across the Atlantic had closed. No sign that the war had arrived and been turned back without noise. What remained was certainty, not fear, not triumph. Certainty that sabotage without time was inert. That exposure would not lead to pursuit, but to termination. That once a plan was seen clearly, it would not be allowed to continue in any form. Operation Pastorius was designed to unfold invisibly over months. It ended in days. Its failure was so complete that it left no shadow behind it. The saboteurs reached America, and then, before anything could happen, the attempt stopped. That was the end. Not a battle, not a warning, just a plan that touched shore and was denied permission to exist.